You don't look like someone who would beg. And yet here you stand, at my gate, with nothing left but the silk on your back and the fire in your spine. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. The iron tasted like betrayal when Edith Winslow pressed her gloved fingers against the frozen gates of Blackwood Hall. Beyond the scrollwork, the estate sprawled in silver shadow beneath a sky that had forgotten mercy. The carriage that brought her had already disappeared into the mist, its wheels crunching away her last connection to anything resembling a future. She stood alone at the threshold of a promise that had already broken itself. In her hand, the contract felt heavier than paper had any right to be. 3 paragraphs of legal script, now voided by a single line scrawled in impatient ink across the bottom. Merchant Caldwell has departed the county. All arrangements hereby dissolved. Estate makes no guarantees. Executor, Blackwood Hall. No signature. No apology. Just 16 words to erase the life she'd spent her last shilling to reach. Behind her, nothing. Before her, locked gates and the glow of a world she was never meant to enter. Through the distant windows of Blackwood Hall, she could see them, dancers in jeweled silk, servants with silver trays, the liquid gold of champagne catching candlelight. Laughter floated across the frozen lawn like music from another realm. Somewhere a string quartet played a waltz she'd only ever heard through walls. The air carried the ghost scent of roasted pheasant and hothouse roses, of bergamot and burning pine. It smelled like every drawing room she'd scrubbed on her knees, every banquet she'd cleared while her own stomach cramped with hunger. Edith remained perfectly still, a figure in pale wedding silk too thin for winter, and calculated whether she had the strength to walk back to the village before the cold took her. She had come here for a man she'd never seen. A merchant who had promised marriage in exchange for household management and companionship in his country residence. It was a transaction, nothing more. She hadn't expected passion or even courtesy. She had expected a roof that didn't leak and a name that might shield her from the streets. That was the bargain. Safety for service. Now she had neither. She pressed the contract against her chest, feeling the parchment crack in the frost, and pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders, though it did nothing against the wind that knifed through her ribs and froze the tears before they could fall. There were 4 pennies in her reticule and half a lemon drop she'd saved from the coaching inn. The fare back to London would cost £3. She didn't have enough for a night's lodging in a barn. And she couldn't go back. Not to the boarding house where the landlady had already rented her room. Not to the factor who'd made it clear what currency he'd accept in exchange for continued employment. Not to the brother who told her she'd die a whore or a wife, and either way, it wasn't his concern. She had bet everything on a merchant who didn't exist and a contract written in disappearing ink. The gates of Blackwood Hall remained locked. The party continued without her. And the clock in the distant bell tower began its slow, relentless march toward midnight on New Year's Eve, the night when every door in England would be bolted tight against bad luck, and she would be left outside them all. That was when she heard the footsteps. Not from the road behind her, but from the shadows ahead. From inside the estate itself. Someone was coming through the dark, moving with deliberate quiet, as though approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. Edith lifted her chin, squared her shoulders beneath the worthless silk, and prepared to beg. Or to disappear. She hadn't yet decided which. The man who emerged from the shadows of Blackwood Hall wore no livery, no ceremonial sash, nothing to mark him as anything more than another servant slipping away from the suffocating glitter of the ballroom. But Edith knew wealth when she saw it, not from the cut of his dark coat, which was plain enough, but from the way he moved through the world as though it had been built to accommodate him. He stopped 3 paces from the gate, studying her with an expression she couldn't read in the darkness. Then, without a word, he produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the iron barrier that had kept her in exile. "You're the bride," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was supposed to be." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Until your merchant decided a contract wasn't binding." "He wasn't my merchant." The man pushed the gate open, the hinges groaning in protest. "And you're freezing. Come." Edith didn't move. Every instinct she'd honed in 10 years of servitude screamed that accepting charity from strange men led to only one destination. "I can manage." With 4 pennies and nowhere to go. He tilted his head, and something in his face softened. "I'm not offering you a room in the house. I'm offering you a seat by a fire before you lose your fingers to frostbite. The choice is yours, but make it quickly. I'd rather not explain to the guests why there's a frozen bride decorating the front lawn." The brutal practicality of it decided her. Edith stepped through the gate. He led her not toward the grand entrance where carriages still arrived in their glittering procession, but along a narrow path that skirted the east wing. They moved in silence through gardens gone skeletal with winter, past fountains choked with ice, until they reached a small stone structure half hidden behind a wall of dormant roses. The potting shed. Inside, it smelled of earth and copper and the ghost of summer greenery. He lit a lamp with swift efficiency, revealing rows of terracotta pots, coils of twine, and a workbench scarred by years of use. In the corner stood a small iron stove, and within minutes he had a fire crackling behind its grated door. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a rough wooden stool. Edith lowered herself carefully, feeling the blood begin its painful return to her numbed limbs. She watched as he disappeared back into the darkness, returning with a cloth-wrapped bundle that he set on the workbench between them. Bread. Not the decorative nonsense from the ballroom, but real bread, dense and dark and still warm from some kitchen hearth. And wine in a simple bottle, the kind servants drank when the quality didn't matter, only the warmth. He tore the loaf in half without ceremony and handed her the larger portion. "I don't need your pity." The words escaped before she could stop them. "Good. I'm not offering any." He poured wine into 2 clay cups stained with soil. "I'm offering you bread because you're hungry, and wine because it's New Year's Eve and no one should spend it alone at a locked gate. That's not pity. That's just what decent people do." Edith took the bread. It was still warm against her frozen palms, and the smell of it made her stomach clench with the hunger she'd been ignoring for 2 days. She ate slowly, trying to preserve some shred of dignity, while across from her the stranger, no, not a stranger, something told her, drank his wine and watched the fire as though he, too, was hiding from the golden prison of the house beyond. "Who are you?" she asked finally. He looked at her then, and in the lamplight she saw the weariness in his eyes, the kind that came from carrying weights no one else could see. "Frederick Montrose," he said quietly. "And this is my family's shed, my family's bread, and my family's house that just turned you away." He raised his cup in a bitter salute. "Welcome to Blackwood Hall." The cottage stood at the edge of the village like something forgotten by time itself. 3 rooms with walls the color of old parchment, a roof that sagged in the middle, and windows that rattled when the wind remembered them. It had belonged to a governess once, Frederick explained as he unlocked the door with a key that looked older than both of them. She died the previous autumn, and the place had stood empty ever since. "No one wants it," he said, pushing the door open to reveal a sparse interior thick with dust and the particular silence of abandoned places. "The villagers think it's haunted. Which means the rent is nothing, and no one will ask questions about who's living here." Edith stepped inside, her boots leaving prints in the dust. A narrow bed frame rusted in the corner. A table with one short leg. A fireplace that hadn't seen flame in months. It was perfect. "How much?" she asked. "I told you." "Nothing. I won't take charity." Frederick turned to face her, and in the thin morning light filtering through dirty windows, she saw the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "Then call it rent paid in advance by the merchant who broke his contract. Call it whatever lets you sleep at night. But you're staying here, and you're going to survive this, and we're not going to argue about it." There was something desperate in the way he said it, as though her survival had become tangled up with his own in ways she didn't yet understand. Over the next week, Frederick appeared at odd hours, never predictably, never announced. He brought firewood that he stacked himself by the door. Blankets that smelled of cedar and old money. A basket of provisions that included not just bread and cheese, but tea and sugar and a tin of biscuits that bore the Blackwood crest. "Don't you have servants for this?" Edith asked one afternoon, watching him repair the cottage's broken shutter with the focused intensity of a man grateful for physical labor. "I have dozens of servants." He drove a nail home with more force than necessary. "And every one of them reports to the Duchess Dowager before they report to me." "Your mother?" "My grandmother. My mother died when I was 12, and the old woman has been running Blackwood Hall ever since." He tested the shutter, then moved to the next. "I'm the Duke in name. She's the Duke in practice. I sign what she tells me to sign, marry who she tells me to marry, and appear at whatever tedious function requires a man in a title to stand in the corner looking appropriately noble." Edith had been sorting through the donated clothing he'd brought, cast-offs from the estate, he'd said, though the quality suggested otherwise. She paused, a dress of deep green wool folded across her lap. "That's why you were outside the gates on New Year's Eve. You were hiding from your own party. I was suffocating in my own house." Frederick set down the hammer and turned to face her. "Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by 100 people and not have a single conversation that matters? To shake hands with men who want your money and dance with women who want your name, while your grandmother orchestrates your entire existence like you're a chess piece she's preparing to sacrifice?" "No." Edith met his eyes. "But I know what it's like to be invisible." Which I suspect is the same thing, just from different angles. Something shifted in his expression then, recognition, perhaps, or relief at being understood. He crossed to the window and looked out at the village below, where smoke rose from chimneys and children played in the street with the easy freedom of people who owned their own choices. "I'm supposed to propose to the Whitmore heiress next month," he said quietly. £50,000 and a breeding history that goes back to the conquest. The Dowager has already picked out the china pattern. "And will you?" Frederick's silence was answer enough. He was a prisoner in velvet chains, and they both knew it. The only difference between them was that Edith had escaped her cage, while he was still deciding whether he had the courage to pick the lock. "Thank you," Edith said finally. "For the cottage?" "For all of it." He nodded without turning. "Lock your door at night. The village is safe enough, but the Dowager's eyes are everywhere, and she doesn't forgive what she considers trespasses against the family name." Then he was gone, disappearing down the lane before she could ask what he meant, or what she'd become in his grandmother's ledger of accounts. The solicitor arrived on a Tuesday morning when the frost still clung to the windows like accusations. Edith heard the carriage before she saw it, wheels crunching over frozen ground with the deliberate pace of something that had come to deliver judgment rather than news. She was mending a torn petticoat by the weak light of the window when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that had nothing of courtesy in them. When she opened the door, the man standing there wore respectability-like armor, black coat, silver-topped cane, and a leather portfolio that bore the Blackwood crest embossed in gold. "Miss Winslow." He didn't wait for confirmation. "I am Mr. Cornelius Thatch, solicitor to the Blackwood estate. May I come in?" It wasn't a request. He was already moving past her into the cottage, his eyes cataloguing everything with the efficiency of a man accustomed to inventorying other people's lives. The meager furniture. The charity blankets. The single dress hanging from a peg by the door. "I'll stand, thank you," he said before she could offer the chair she didn't have. He opened the portfolio with practiced precision and withdrew a document sealed with red wax. "I've been instructed to deliver this notice on behalf of Her Grace, the Duchess Dowager of Blackwood." Edith took the paper, feeling the weight of expensive stationery and expensive threats. The wax seal bore the family crest, a raven with spread wings clutching a broken chain. "How appropriate." "You'll find the terms quite clear," Thatch continued, his voice carrying the particular coldness of men who did cruel work for powerful employers. "You are to vacate this cottage and depart the county within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in charges of vagrancy being brought against you in magistrate's court." "Vagrancy?" Edith looked up from the unread document. "I have a home." "You have a cottage provided through unknown means, no visible employment, and no legal residence in this county. The law takes a dim view of unmarried women who appear without explanation and linger without purpose." He adjusted his spectacles, and she saw the gleam of satisfaction there. "Particularly when such women insinuate themselves into the attentions of titled gentlemen." So that was it. The Dowager had seen Frederick's visits, or one of her legion of servants had reported them, and now Edith was being erased like a mistake in a ledger. "The Duke himself arranged this cottage," Edith said, keeping her voice level though her hands trembled around the paper. "Perhaps you should take your concerns to him. His Grace is a young man of considerable empathy and occasional poor judgment. Her Grace the Dowager administers the estate and ensures that the family's reputation remains unblemished." Thatch's smile was a surgical instrument. "You, Miss Winslow, are a blemish. A failed mail-order bride with no family, no resources, and no prospects. The kind of woman who ruins good men through proximity alone." Edith felt the words land like blows, each one carefully chosen to hit where she was already wounded. Failed. No family. No prospects. She'd heard variations of this assessment her entire life, but hearing it delivered in legal language, backed by aristocratic power, made it feel like objective truth rather than cruelty. And if I refuse to leave? The question came out smaller than she intended. Thatch withdrew a second document from his portfolio. Then you'll become acquainted with the conditions of the county workhouse. I'm told they're particularly rigorous for women of dubious character. He placed the paper on her table, beside the half-mended petticoat that suddenly looked like evidence of her inadequacy. 7 days, Miss Winslow. I suggest you use them wisely. He left without another word, his carriage wheels crushing the frost into water, into nothing. Edith stood in the open doorway long after he'd gone, holding the Dowager's ultimatum in hands that had finally stopped shaking. The broken seal had left a smear of red wax on her thumb, and she rubbed at it absently, thinking of blood and chains and ravens that ate the eyes of women who dared to look at things they weren't meant to see. 7 days. Then she would disappear, or she would fight. She looked at the cottage, her cottage, for however briefly it had been hers, and made her choice. Frederick came after dark, as he always did now, but this time he wore a farmer's coat and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Edith almost didn't recognize him when he knocked, 2 soft raps, then 3, their agreed signal, and when she opened the door he slipped inside with the furtive urgency of a man being hunted. "You shouldn't be here," she said, even as relief flooded through her. She'd spent 3 days alone with the Dowager's ultimatum, watching the deadline approach like an execution date. "I know." He set down a canvas sack that clinked with the promise of provisions. "Thatch came to see you." "Don't lie." "How did you?" "Because I know my grandmother, and I know what she does to things that displease her. She cuts them out like rot from an apple." Frederick pulled off his cap, revealing hair dampened with nervous sweat despite the cold. "What did he threaten you with?" "Vagrancy charges. 7 days to leave or face the magistrate." Edith kept her voice steady, refusing to let him see how the words had burrowed into her sleep. "It's fine. I'll manage." "It's not fine, and you won't manage, because there's nowhere for you to go." He began unpacking the sack with jerky movements: bread, cheese, a jar of preserves, candles. "She's doing this because of me. Because I've been coming here, because she thinks you're some kind of threat to her precious arranged marriage." "Aren't I?" The question hung between them, dangerous and true. Frederick stopped unpacking. In the firelight his face looked younger than his years, and infinitely weary. "Yes. But not for the reasons she thinks." Before Edith could ask what he meant, he crossed to the window and looked out at the village below. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted up from the public house, a fiddle playing something old and wistful, the kind of tune meant for dancing. "Do you know what I've never done?" Frederick asked suddenly. "Danced with someone I chose. Every ball, every assembly, my grandmother presents me with a list of acceptable partners. Women whose bloodline she's vetted, whose dowries she's calculated to the penny. I've waltzed with duchesses and country squires' daughters, and I've never once asked a woman to dance because I wanted to." He turned back to her, and something in his expression made Edith's breath catch. "Dance with me," he said. "Here?" She looked around the shabby cottage, at the dust mote swirling in lamplight, at the space barely large enough for 2 people to stand without touching. "Here. Now. Before she takes this away too." The music from the village seemed louder suddenly, or perhaps Edith was just finally allowing herself to hear it. Frederick held out his hand, and for a long moment she stared at it, at the calluses that had formed from repairing her shutters, at the ink stains that marked him as more than just ornamental nobility. She took his hand. They had no room for proper steps, no space for the elaborate choreography of ballroom etiquette. Instead they swayed in the narrow gap between table and hearth, moving to music that barely reached them, learning the shape of each other in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or duty or family expectations. Frederick's hand settled at her waist with a gentleness that made something crack open in Edith's chest. She'd been touched before, measured for uniforms, shoved aside in crowded kitchens, groped by men who thought poverty was permission. But this was different. This was being seen as something more than a function or a failure. "I'm not the Whitmore heiress," she whispered against his shoulder. "No." His breath stirred her hair. "You're better. You're real." The fiddle music swelled and faded, and still they moved in their small circle, dancing in dust and firelight while the world outside conspired to tear them apart. For the first time since standing at those locked gates, Edith felt like more than a voided contract or a failed transaction. She felt like a woman. She felt like herself. When the music finally stopped, Frederick didn't let go immediately. He stood there, his forehead nearly touching hers, and she could feel him trembling, not from cold, but from something far more dangerous. "I won't let her drive you away," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I won't." Edith wanted to believe him. But she'd learned long ago that wanting and having were countries separated by an ocean of cruel reality, and kind words from dukes changed nothing about the world that crushed women like her without a second thought. The first letter appeared on Sunday morning, pinned to the door of the church like one of Luther's theses. Edith didn't see it herself. She'd learned quickly that church was for villagers with clean consciences and cleaner reputations, but Mrs. Holloway from the bakery told her about it while refusing to sell her bread. "Says you drove that merchant Caldwell to ruin with your scheming ways," the baker's wife announced loud enough for the other customers to hear. "Says you came here pretending to be an innocent bride when all along you were after his money. Says he had to flee the county to escape your clutches, and now you're setting your sights on better prey." The letter wasn't signed, naturally. Poison never was. By Monday afternoon, 3 more had appeared, one at the milliner's, another at the posting house, and a third nailed to the village notice board where everyone gathered to read about crop prices and lost sheep. Each one elaborated on the previous accusation with the kind of specific detail that only came from someone with access to her history. Or someone inventing it wholesale. Miss E. Winslow, lately arrived from London under false pretenses. Known associations with men of questionable character. Suspect in the financial collapse of merchant Caldwell, who departed hastily owing significant debts. Now residing in unlawful cohabitation with the governess's cottage, funded by means unknown. A danger to decent society, an unmarried gentleman of means. Edith read this one herself, standing in the village square while the butcher's apprentice smirked at her and a cluster of shopkeepers' wives whispered behind gloved hands. The paper was expensive, cream-colored stock with a watermark she couldn't quite make out. The handwriting was educated, each letter formed with the precision of someone who'd had extensive tutoring in penmanship. Someone with money. Someone with motive. Someone who wanted Edith not just gone, but destroyed. The consequences came swiftly. Mrs. Holloway stopped selling her bread entirely. The seamstress who'd promised Edith piecework suddenly remembered she had no available commissions. The landlord of the public house told her, not unkindly, that perhaps she'd be more comfortable taking her custom elsewhere. Within 3 days, Edith found herself cut off from every shop and service the village offered. She was being starved out, socially and literally. Frederick came on the 4th night, bringing food she could no longer buy and fury he could barely contain. He threw the latest letter, he'd torn it down from the smithy's door, onto her table with enough force to rattle the lamp. "This is her," he said without preamble. "The Dowager's doing. She's weaponizing the entire village against you." "I know." Edith had already burned the 2 copies she'd collected herself, watching the lies curl and blacken in her fireplace. "And it's working. No one will speak to me. Mrs. Holloway crossed herself when she saw me yesterday, like I carry plague. Then leave. Not the county, leave with me. Tonight." Frederick gripped the back of her chair, his knuckles white. "I have money of my own, property in Scotland that my mother left me. We could run." Edith met his eyes. "And prove every word of those letters true? Confirm to your grandmother and everyone else that I'm exactly the kind of woman who seduces dukes and destroys their prospects. I don't care what they think. You should. Because they'll think it of you too. The duke who threw away his duty for a scheming mail-order bride. Is that the story you want written about your life?" Frederick released the chair and turned away, his shoulders rigid with frustration. "So what, then? You'll just let her win? Let her drive you into poverty and ruin because you're too proud to accept help?" "I'll let her reveal herself," Edith said quietly. "These letters are desperate, Frederick. She's spending money and effort to destroy someone who should be beneath her notice. That means I'm not beneath her notice. That means she's afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of you choosing something real over something convenient." Edith stood and crossed to him, placing one hand on his arm. "She can't force you to marry the Whitmore girl if you refuse. So she's trying to eliminate your alternative. But the harder she pushes, the more obvious her manipulation becomes. And while she reveals herself, you starve. I've starved before." Edith squeezed his arm once, then released him. "The question is whether you have the courage to disappoint your grandmother when the moment comes." Frederick looked at her with something between admiration and anguish. Outside, the village bells tolled 9, and somewhere in the darkness another letter was probably being written, another lie being carefully constructed to poison the well of public opinion. But Edith was done running from poison. She'd learned to build immunity instead. Before we continue, if this tale has stirred your curiosity, a simple like or subscription is most appreciated. And if you wish, share in the comments where you are listening from. Now, let us return to the story. The village hall smelled of mulled wine and self-congratulation. Edith stood at the back of the crowded room, feeling every pair of eyes that had tracked her entrance like a predator marking prey. She'd worn her best dress, the green wool Frederick had brought her, and pinned her hair with the kind of severity that suggested she had nothing to apologize for. Let them stare. She hadn't come for their approval. The annual New Year's charity auction was the village's premier social event, where the wealthy donated items they no longer wanted and congratulated themselves for helping the deserving poor. Which apparently did not include mail-order brides of questionable virtue. The room buzzed with conversation that died to pointed whispers whenever someone noticed her presence. Lady Pemberton, the magistrate's wife, turned her back entirely. The vicar's sister clutched her reticule as though Edith might snatch it. Mrs. Holloway, positioned near the refreshment table like a sentry, made a show of blessing herself when their eyes met. Edith ignored them all. She was here for the silk. The auctioneer, a jovial man named Barnaby who ran the coaching inn, had just finished selling a hideous oil painting of someone's deceased spaniel when he lifted the next item. Even from the back of the room, Edith could see the quality of the fabric. Dove grey silk with an almost imperceptible sheen, enough yardage to make a proper gown. The kind of material that would prove to any dressmaker in the county that she understood fine work, that her hands were skilled enough to be trusted with commissions that mattered. Donated by Lady Ashford, Barnaby announced. Finest silk from her late mother's trousseau, never used. We'll start the bidding at 2 shillings. 2 shillings. Edith had exactly 3 shillings and 4pence to her name, the sum total of what remained after a week of being unable to purchase food anywhere in the village. She'd been living on what Frederick smuggled to her and the dubious charity of a farmer's widow who sold her eggs at cost because she'd once been poor herself. 2 shillings, called a woman Edith didn't recognize. 2 and 6, countered another. Edith waited. The bidding climbed to 4 shillings, then 5. She watched the silk catch the lamplight, watched her chance at legitimate work slipping away with each increment. At 6 shillings, only 2 bidders remained, both well-dressed matrons who probably wanted the fabric for their daughters. 6 shillings and 6pence, the first woman said with finality. The room fell silent. Barnaby raised his gavel. Going once. 7 shillings. Edith's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Every head turned. The whispers started immediately, hissing through the crowd like steam escaping a kettle. Edith kept her eyes on the auctioneer, her chin lifted, her hand steady at her sides even though her heart hammered against her ribs. 7 shillings was more than she had. It was a bluff born of desperation and the faint hope that no one would challenge her. The magistrate's wife leaned toward her companion. The audacity! 7 shillings, Barnaby repeated, his jovial expression faltering. Do I hear? 8 shillings. The voice came from the front of the room, cold and crystalline and unmistakable. The crowd parted like water, revealing the Duchess Dowager herself, resplendent in black velvet and pearls that probably cost more than the entire auction's proceeds. She hadn't been there moments ago. She'd arrived just in time to hear Edith bid. The Dowager smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who'd just spotted a rat in her grain stores. 8 shillings for the silk. Surely that's generous enough for charity. Edith felt the trap close. She could withdraw now, admit defeat, slink back to her cottage. Or she could stand her ground and be publicly humiliated when she couldn't pay. 10 shillings. Frederick's voice rang out from the doorway. He strode into the room still wearing his riding coat, his hair wind-dishevelled, looking every inch the Duke and nothing like the careful, controlled man his grandmother had tried to make him. 10 shillings, and the silk goes to Miss Winslow. The room erupted. Women gasped. Men muttered. The Dowager's face turned to marble. Your Grace, Barnaby stammered. The bidding is at 10 shillings for the benefit of Miss. I'm aware of who benefits. Frederick pulled a purse from his coat and counted out coins with deliberate precision, placing them on the table beside the auctioneer. Then he lifted the bolt of silk and walked directly to Edith, the crowd parting before him like he was Moses at the Red Sea. He placed the fabric in her arms. His hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, and when he spoke, it was loud enough for everyone to hear. For the dressmaker who will build something from nothing. Which is more than most of us here can claim. Then he turned on his heel and left, leaving Edith holding 7 yards of silk and the attention of every scandalized soul in the village. Including his grandmother, whose eyes promised that this particular transgression would not be forgiven. The Duchess Dowager came to the cottage herself, which told Edith everything she needed to know about how dangerous she'd become. Women of that rank didn't make house calls to people they considered beneath them. They sent solicitors and servants and anonymous letters. They didn't soil their own hands with the work of erasure. But here she stood in Edith's doorway, dressed in mourning black though no one in the family had died, her silver-headed cane tapping once against the threshold like a judge's gavel. "May I come in?" The question was purely rhetorical. She was already moving past Edith into the cottage, her sharp eyes cataloguing the space with the same efficiency Thatch had employed. The silk Frederick had bought sat on the table, partially cut into pattern pieces. Evidence of ambition. Evidence of staying. "Your Grace." Edith didn't curtsy. Let that be the first battle line drawn. "Miss Winslow." The Dowager settled into the cottage single chair as though it were a throne, arranging her skirts with precision. "We find ourselves in an unfortunate situation." "Do we?" "My grandson has developed an attachment to you that is both inappropriate and unsustainable. I'm sure you understand the impossibility of the scenario." She spoke with the kind of calm that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted. "Frederick is the Duke of Blackwood. He will marry a woman of suitable breeding and fortune. He will produce heirs that strengthen the family's position. He will not throw away 500 years of lineage for a seamstress with a scandalous past." "I have no past," Edith said quietly. "Only a present that your letters tried very hard to invent." The Dowager's smile was thin as a knife blade. "The content of those letters is irrelevant. What matters is that people believe them. And people believe what serves their interests to believe. You're a convenient villain, Miss Winslow. The scheming woman who ensnared a duke. It's a very old story, and it always ends the same way." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a bank draft. The paper made a crisp sound as she unfolded it and placed it on the table beside the silk. Even from where she stood, Edith could see the amount. £500. More money than she'd earn in 10 years of seamstress work. Enough to start a shop in another county, to live independently, to never again stand shivering at locked gates while her stomach cramped with hunger. "That is what your disappearance is worth to me," the Dowager said. "Leave tonight. Leave quietly. Leave permanently. Change your name if you're clever. I don't care where you go as long as Frederick never sees you again." Edith stared at the draft. £500. Freedom. Safety. Everything she'd come to Blackwood Hall seeking, now offered in exchange for simply walking away from a man who'd shared bread with her in a potting shed. "And if I refuse?" Her voice came out steady, though her hands trembled. "Then I will destroy you." The Dowager stood, leaning slightly on her cane. "Not through letters this time. I'll have the magistrate bring charges of fraud and theft. I'll ensure that Caldwell's creditors pursue you for his debts. I'll see you arrested, tried, and transported to the colonies, where women like you are ground into dust and forgotten." She paused, letting the threat settle. Or you can take the money and build the life you claim to want, far from here where Frederick's memory of you will fade like summer frost. Edith picked up the bank draft. It felt obscene in her hands, heavy with the weight of her own erasure. She thought of Frederick's face when he'd given her the silk. She thought of the dance in the firelight, of his hands at her waist, of the way he'd looked at her like she was something more than a mistake to be corrected. She thought of every time she'd been offered survival in exchange for her dignity. "This is very generous," Edith said slowly. She walked to the fireplace where the evening's kindling was already laid. "But I think I'd rather burn it." The Dowager's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the first cold touch of uncertainty. "You're making a mistake." "Probably." Edith held the draft over the flames. "But it will be my mistake, not yours. I've spent my entire life accepting what powerful people decided I deserved. I think I'm done with that now." She dropped the bank draft into the fire. It caught immediately, the number dissolving into ash and smoke, 500 pounds of freedom turning to nothing in seconds. The Dowager watched it burn, her knuckles white on her cane. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its practiced calm. "You'll regret this." "Perhaps." Edith met her eyes. "But at least I'll regret my own choices, not yours." The Dowager left without another word, her cane tapping sharply against the floor like a declaration of war. Edith stood by the fire long after she'd gone, watching the last fragments of the bank draft curl into nothing, and wondered if courage and stupidity had always been the same thing, viewed from different angles. The town square was packed with bodies and expectation. News had spread through the village like wildfire. The Dowager had called a public assembly to address matters of moral urgency affecting the community's welfare. Everyone knew what that meant. Everyone had come to watch Edith Winslow be publicly ruined. She stood near the fountain, aware of the semicircle of space that surrounded her like a quarantine zone. No one would stand too close to the condemned. The morning sun was unexpectedly warm, melting the last stubborn patches of snow that had clung to the cobblestones since New Year's Eve. Water dripped from shop awnings and ran in tiny rivulets toward the drains, carrying winter away. The Dowager arrived in her carriage, flanked by Thatch the solicitor and two men Edith didn't recognize, constables, perhaps, or witnesses hired to lend credibility to whatever performance was about to unfold. She mounted the steps of the village hall with the bearing of a general taking the field, her black dress stark against the warming sky. "Good people of Blackwood," she began, her voice carrying across the square with practiced projection. "I come before you today with a heavy heart. We have among us a woman who has deceived this community, who has preyed upon the charitable nature of my grandson, and who continues to resist all reasonable efforts to resolve this matter with discretion." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Edith felt their eyes on her like insects crawling across her skin. "I offered Miss Winslow a generous settlement to relocate and begin a new life elsewhere. I offered her dignity and opportunity." The Dowager's gaze found Edith in the crowd. She refused. She chose instead to remain here, poisoning my family's reputation and encouraging my grandson's misguided sympathies. That's not what happened. Edith's voice cut through the murmurs. She hadn't planned to speak yet, but the lie was too precise, too calculated to let pass unchallenged. The crowd shifted, heads turning. The Dowager's expression remained serene, but her knuckles whitened on her cane. "You offered me £500 to disappear," Edith continued, stepping forward into the space that separated her from the Dowager's platform. Not as charity. As payment for my silence. Payment to ensure your grandson would marry the woman you'd chosen for him, regardless of what he wanted. This is absurd, the Dowager said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Is it? Edith reached into her pocket and withdrew a fragment of paper, a corner of the bank draft that hadn't fully burned, bearing the Dowager's signature and part of the amount. She'd saved it without fully knowing why, some instinct telling her that proof would matter. You came to my cottage. You threatened me with false charges and transportation to the colonies. You told me I would be ground into dust and forgotten. She looked around at the assembled villagers, at their shocked faces. That was your offer of dignity. The square erupted in whispers. The Dowager descended 2 steps, her composure cracking. You dare. I dare because I have nothing left to lose, Edith said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. You've already taken everything. My reputation. My livelihood. My place in this community. The only thing you haven't taken is my voice, and I will not let you silence that too. Miss Winslow speaks the truth. Frederick's voice rang out from the edge of the crowd. He pushed through the assembly, still in riding clothes, breathing hard as though he'd galloped from the estate. My grandmother has orchestrated a campaign of harassment against a woman whose only crime was being abandoned at our gates. She wrote the anonymous letters. She pressured the shopkeepers to deny Miss Winslow service. She threatened her with arrest on fabricated charges. Frederick, you don't understand, the Dowager began. I understand perfectly. He climbed the steps to stand beside his grandmother, forcing her to look up at him. I understand that you've spent your entire life controlling this family like pieces on a chessboard. I understand that you see people as obstacles or assets, never as human beings deserving of basic dignity. He turned to face the crowd. Miss Winslow came here seeking safety and found cruelty instead. She's asked for nothing but the chance to work and live in peace. If this community has any conscience at all, you'll give her that. The silence that followed was profound. The Dowager stood frozen on the steps, her careful composure shattered, her power suddenly revealed as nothing more than the ability to intimidate people into compliance. Without their fear, she was just an old woman clinging to control she no longer deserved. I will not be lectured by my own grandson, she said finally, but the words came out thin and desperate. Then consider it a resignation. Frederick descended the steps and walked to Edith, offering his hand. I'm done being your chess piece, grandmother. Find another duke to play with. Edith took his hand, and together they walked through the crowd, no longer a mail-order bride and a captive duke, but 2 people who'd chosen each other despite every force aligned against them. Spring came to Blackwood Village with the kind of insistent warmth that made winter feel like a lie someone had told. Edith's shop occupied a narrow building on Church Street, wedged between the apothecary and a bookbinder who played violin badly but with tremendous enthusiasm. The sign above her door read simply, Eve Winslow, dressmaker, in letters she'd painted herself. Inside, bolts of fabric lined the walls in careful rows. The dove-grey silk had become a dress for the mayor's daughter, her first commission, paid in full and without scandal. More work had followed. Not from everyone, certainly. Lady Pemberton still crossed the street when she saw Edith coming. But enough of the village had witnessed the town square confrontation to decide that perhaps they'd been wrong about the scheming mail-order bride. Or perhaps they simply appreciated fine stitching more than they feared the Dowager's disapproval. Edith was pinning a hem when she heard the bell above the door. She looked up to find Frederick standing in her shop, hat in hand, looking profoundly out of place among the feminine abundance of lace and ribbon. "Your Grace," she said, not quite teasing. "Frederick," he corrected. "Just Frederick now." He'd kept his title. You couldn't simply abandon a dukedom, no matter how much you wanted to, but he'd transferred most of the estate management to a board of trustees and moved into the old gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of the property. He farmed now, or attempted to. The village consensus was that he was terrible at it but improving. "What brings you to Church Street?" Edith set down her pins. "I was hoping you might have time for supper." He shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. "Not at the estate." "At your table." "If you'll have me." Edith studied him, this man who'd shared bread with her in a potting shed when she had nothing, who'd bought her silk when the world wanted her erased, who'd walked away from 500 years of carefully controlled legacy because she'd been brave enough to refuse a bribe. "I don't have much," she warned. "Bread and cheese. Some apples from Mrs. Patterson's orchard." "That sounds perfect." She closed the shop early, turning the sign to face the street, and they walked together to the rooms above where she lived now. Not a cottage haunted by a governess's ghost, but space she'd earned with her own skilled hands. Frederick didn't offer to carry anything or open doors or perform any of the small gallantries that marked a rescue. He simply followed her up the narrow stairs and took the seat she offered at her small table, settling in like a man who'd finally found his way home. Outside, the church bells marked the hour. Somewhere in Blackwood Hall, the Dowager was probably orchestrating someone else's life with chessboard precision. But here, in rooms that smelled of fabric and possibility, Edith poured wine into mismatched cups and broke bread with the man who'd chosen substance over stone. It wasn't the life either of them had been promised. It was better. If you found comfort or meaning in this tale, a simple like and subscription is greatly appreciated. And if you wish, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. Thank you.